they talk about catastrophic risks. And the two main risks to our survival, in fact, from this report is nuclear weapons and climate threats. They do go together. They do make each other worse. And war, I believe, war in general, I believe, is the number one driver of climate change emissions, particularly carbon dioxide emissions now.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens, your host. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future. We're recording today as the conflict in the Middle East involving Iran and the United States and Israel, and increasingly many other countries, enters its second week with no end in sight. While the world's attention is rightfully on the devastating loss of life and the destruction of habitats and infrastructure across the Middle East, there is a parallel catastrophe unfolding that is rarely discussed, and that is the staggering surge in greenhouse gas emissions, both direct and indirect, resulting from these military activities. This is a kind of hidden tax on each one of us. These emissions don't just pollute, they accelerate the climate crisis, creating a feedback loop of destruction that transcends borders. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on this sort of hidden super emitter epidemic. To help us navigate the legal and systemic challenges of this crisis, I'm honored and delighted to welcome back Dan Galpern. Dan is a globally recognized attorney who has spent years pursuing climate justice through legal action with many countries all over the planet. He is the founder of the Climate Protection and Restoration Initiative, and he serves as counsel to the esteemed climate scientist, Dr. James Hansen. Joining us as well are our regular panelists, Paul Beckwith and Dr. Peter Carter. Please stay with us until the end of the program, when I'll be presenting the Climate 3, the most critical climate stories of the past week, each in 1 minute. Today we'll be covering experimental efforts to alter ocean alkalinity, an analysis of China's latest 5-year plan, and the puzzling contrast between the impact of wildfires in Alaska versus those next door in Canada. As always, if you find this conversation vital, please like, subscribe, and share the program. We welcome your comments and ideas for future episodes. You can also support our work at theclimateemergencyforum.org. So let's dive in. Dan, it's so good to see you again. We're eager to hear your perspective on the current conflict. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Herb. I'm glad that you are drawing attention to the war as a super emitter event. I actually do not have any specific details on the quantities of additional emissions that have been released because of the military attacks, including, as Paul noted to me earlier today, the attacks on 3 tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. But I have no doubt that this war is going to vastly amplify greenhouse gas emissions from the region. I am, of course, additionally concerned about the war for a number of reasons, including, as I mentioned in an article that came out recently in the Eugene Weekly here, and also on our website, cprclimate.org, where I issued a blog entitled Illegality All Around, Whither the UN Climate Treaty. I'm concerned with a number of things, including the potential for escalation of this war, even beyond the region, to include, for example, the potential introduction of the utilization of tactical nuclear weapons. It's not much discussed, but the United States has studiously refused to enter into a no first use of nuclear weapons commitment that has been advocated by a number of scholars over the years. And so too, since 1993, has Russia refused to enter into a no first use of nuclear weapons commitment. This is important, of course, because, as has been revealed in recent days, Russia is assisting Iran, at least somewhat, with its targeting of U.S. military installations in the region in response to the joint U.S. and Israeli attack on Iranian military installations and other buildings, including civilian infrastructure in Iran, although that may be inadvertent, but it has been happening. It's been happening since day one. The common denominator that I'd like to bring to the attention of the panel here and the public, your viewers, is the illegality all around stemming from the United States. First of all, under the United Nations Charter, it is forbidden for any nation to use or threaten to use military force against another unless in self-defense, including in self-defense against what is a provably imminent attack, or at the direction of the United Nations Security Council, for example. Here, there is no such action by the United Nations. In fact, the world community by and large has condemned this unilateral attack by the United States and Israel against Iran. There's no plausible justification for it. And as evidence for that, you can just point to the stream of changing, variable justifications for this war that have issued from the president himself, from Secretary of Defense, from Hegseth, from Secretary of State Marco. And so it is clear that there was no provocation on order of stemming an imminent attack against the United States issuing from Iran. So at the international law level, there's no justification. So too is this engagement by the United States, this war of choice, unlawful under United States law. First of all, it is for Congress and not the president to declare a war. And secondly, formally, they may be adhering to the loose strictures of the War Powers Act, but they have not received any declaration from Congress. They have not received any approval. They have not even had a significant debate before any congressional committee in Congress. So this war is unlawful, unilateral from the get-go. And in fact, it appears that there were negotiations between the United States and Iran mediated by the foreign minister of Oman that were bearing fruit. In fact, the foreign minister of Oman, our chosen mediator, flew back to Washington on February 25 to brief U.S. officials and to speak to the public as a whole, including the international public. And he said, in fact, they had made tremendous progress towards a deal to eliminate Iran's nuclear weapons and its stores of uranium. It appears that we raced to war in the Middle East, the United States and Israel, before those negotiations could bear fruit. So finally, I think that there is a connection between that unilateralism, so to speak, and the United States withdrawal from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The common denominator here between this unilateral war of choice and the United States withdrawal from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is fairly clear. These are unilateral acts by the White House, by the president, in contravention of law. I've just discussed the unlawful nature of the U.S. attack in conjunction with Israel on Iran. But in addition, as you will recall, the United States entered into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the world's climate treaty, in 1992 with the express concurrence of the United States Senate. So you would not think that the president would have the power to simply withdraw the United States, the world's largest historical emitter, from the world's climate treaty. And yet, that is what he has actually done. And in fact, the decision to attack Iran and the decision to convey the formal notification of withdrawal from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was made on the same day here in the United States, February 27. So at bottom, the common denominator here is unlawful, unilateral usurpation by the executive, the President of the United States, of power that the Constitution invests, at least in part, with Congress and specifically the United States Senate.
Thank you, Dan. That's a very sobering analysis and a deeply concerning one. In fact, one could say, I think fairly, that one could extend your comments to say that this administration has also defied the courts with regularity, on all sorts of issues and has defied Congress and defied basically anyone that gets in its way. And we'll talk more about that. So the climate consequences are severe, but they're only one dimension of that. So appreciate that perspective, Dan. And let me go now to Paul Beckwith. Paul, what are your thoughts on the war as a kind of a super emitter of greenhouse gases?
Thank you. So what we're seeing today, of course, is many states becoming war-based nation states and using the idea of going to war and preparing for war, always being in the background is one of the organizing principles of modern day superpowers. There's massive hidden climate and ecological costs. We can call it fossil fuel militarism. And as you mentioned, war is a hidden climate super emitter. So just some numbers, global military's expenditure is about 5 to 5.5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. If militaries of the world were a country, they'd be, I think, number 4 or something. And that's now, today, and yet there's escalating military spending. There's been large wars. We talk about war on terror. There's a Ukraine-Russia attacking Ukraine, now Iran. But don't forget, Venezuela, the president was just deported in a raid and captured, and so that the oil companies would do what the US government wants. I like to think of China as actually a bright note because they're aiming to completely electrify their grid, get completely off fossil fuels. Cuba's been blockaded, so not getting oil, and they're talking about, imagine if they were getting their power from electrical panels and so on. So what's going on? War, we know that war begets war, creates lots of hatred. And if you look at all aspects of war and how it worsens climate change, first of all, you have the huge military-industrial complex developing missiles and weapons, and then you have deployment, you have aircraft carriers task force going halfway around the world and deploying. You have all the aircraft to deliver those missiles. So look at the carbon emissions from all that. And then they're actually destroying a target, whether it be Gaza or whether it be Tehran or other places. There's huge emissions from destroying the buildings and the infrastructure. And then we haven't even talked about rebuilding. Imagine the carbon that will be put up in the atmosphere from rebuilding Gaza, for example, or rebuilding Tehran and destroyed things there. So there's all of these costs, but then and also on the other hand, climate change is making things a lot worse because a few months ago, there was a lot of news about Iran running out of water, basically, reservoir levels way down. They were talking about having to move the capital of Iran, moving Tehran to the north, to areas where there's more water. Of course, climate change is causing shortages of all kinds of different things around the world. It's causing water scarcity. It's causing food shortages. All of these things make people angry and make them more prone to go to war. So we're in a vicious cycle here, an extremely vicious cycle, which threatens all life on this planet.
Oh, I'll just take a deep breath listening to that, Paul. It's just unrelieved bad news. But again, we're the Climate Emergency Forum, so we're used to that. We try to be used to that. All right. Well, let me, after those sobering comments from Dan and now Paul, Peter, what are your thoughts?
Thank you Dan for that legalistic assessment, which is really important. Of course, I totally agree with everything that Paul has just said. I can offer a few quotes and ideas in support of that. It's all about oil, right? This is all about oil. We've seen one war after another, and this is another. I became aware of that relationship many years ago when I read Daniel Yergin's book, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power. He's an oil man, so he knew, and they both drive each other together, as Paul indeed pointed out. I got a few quotes. At the beginning of this year, end of January, The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists presented their annual Doomsday Clock. By the way, this is a really strong group of scientists. If you go to the website, they follow energy and climate all the time. They got great articles. Anyway, as you may know, what happened in January was that the clock was moved the closest to midnight that it has ever been. In other words, we're at the closest to doomsday that we have ever been. In my mind, that's really rather obvious. They talk about catastrophic risks, and the two main risks to our survival, in fact, from this report is nuclear weapons and climate threats. They do go together. They do make each other worse. And war, I believe, war in general, I believe, is the number one driver of climate change emissions, particularly carbon dioxide emissions. Now, we are looking at this in the media as if this is an energy oil emergency. This really just highlights the fact that we're in a climate change, planetary global heating emergency. And what are we doing? Rushing to worry about oil availability. It's absolutely the wrong way. So a quote, I came across a YouTube by Yuval Harari, the famous author who wrote the book Sapiens. Well, he's got another book on the go now. He opened the YouTube by posing the question, why are we on the verge of destroying ourselves? And he referred to being on the verge of ecological collapse or a third world war, or even our destruction by AI. It's a very good YouTube. He's a very smart guy, and it's well worth watching. He said the problem is not human nature. It's a lot of other influences. Now, my final point was just yesterday, I happened to come across a book published by Buckminster Fuller, one of my favorite people, big brain, amazing author, invented all kinds of wonderful things. Was very popular in the 60s. He published a book of his lectures in the 60s, and the book was published in 1969. So what we're talking about goes back a long way. That's what I'm driving at. The book was called Utopia or Oblivion, The Prospects for Humanity. And what he pointed out was, and I can remember this now, for the first time in history, that we collectively possess the technological and resource-based capability to provide for 100% of humanity, eliminate world poverty and everything else. That's a state that he called utopia, and I have been talking about dreaming and working towards the best possible future. And he says failure to do this, failure to cooperate internationally and globally, he says, is on the way to oblivion.
Well, I was expecting you to give us a little bit of hope, Peter, but you've disappointed me once again. No, I think we have three dimensions from Paul, Peter, and Dan of a intractable and ever-growing crisis with multiple dimensions to it. Who wants to try?
With all respect to Yuval Harari, I have read a number of his things. He's brilliant. But I think that our predicament now, looked at from a more general perspective, is a function of our failure today to utilize the tools of democracy that are at our disposal. And correlatively, I think that the solution is to more effectively utilize those tools of democracy while we still have them. And of course, that's an open question, but we do still have them. The capacity, for example, even in the United States, and willingness to utilize force against citizens is still constrained by our Constitution and our courts. We are right now as Herb noted, in quite the contest between this administration, this lawless administration, and the judicial system. And just a few weeks ago, we had our U.S. Supreme Court on a 6-3 vote reject one of the central pieces of the Trump agenda, his ability to unilaterally impose virtually unlimited tariffs against other nations without the involvement or approval of Congress. Well, here too, I mentioned in my discussion to date that there is a War Powers Act in the United States. I think it's way too weak, but still it exists. And it is a tool for Congress, as the more adequate representative of the will of the people who oppose this war, to weigh in and to limit the ability of the United States to maintain this war long term. And in fact, we're taping on March 11 now, I should say. In fact, just 6 days ago, there was a vote on a strong war powers resolution that failed, but only by a handful, I think 7 votes. And members of Congress are hearing more and more from their constituents. That is only the first attempt. I expect that members will bring that type of restriction on the president's ability to unlimitedly prosecute this war back again and again. Similarly, I mentioned that the same sort of unilateral usurpation of authority that should be shared between the executive branch and the Congress, it characterizes the Trump unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the world's climate treaty. Congress, in fact, there's been no debate about it, but in fact could stand up, either house of Congress, by the way, to pass a resolution of disapproval, saying the United States, in fact, should not withdraw from the world's climate treaty. And because withdrawal does not take effect until 12 months have passed, there's time for Congress to get engaged and to press that agenda along, to urge Congress to stand up against this president's unilateral withdrawal from the world's most important and, sole international climate treaty that governs 194 nations, or should. We have launched a petition called Remain In. The United States must not withdraw from the world's climate change treaty. And it is available to listeners, and I believe that information will be placed underneath for people who wish to take action. It's an easy action. It doesn't require one to stick one's neck out very much. There'll be hundreds of others, or maybe thousands of others, signing this petition, calling upon the United States Senate and the United States Congress to weigh in. So anyhow, I think the hopeful point that I wish to make is that there are certainly a lot of things that people can do in terms of reaching out to Congress, signing petitions. And lastly, I should say that there is organizing that right now, at least in the United States, for another major rally against this lawless government and a demand for market change. I believe that is going to be on March 28. It's billed to be the largest protest that has ever been held. And that is the reason why in this recent article that I published, I titled the main part of it, Protest and Survive. I think that we need to exercise our rights in the United States guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and get busy and active. Thanks for the opportunity to say that, hopefully somewhat hopeful piece.
Well, thanks, Dan. And we hope that those of you who are from the United States, and that's not the majority of people who watch this, but will consider signing this. And we hope people in other nations will try to do likewise with their own governments, whatever form that may take. So let me get back to Paul and any additional comments that you have on what we've talked about so far.
I think the fog of war is getting much thicker with the involvement of AI. AI is being used significantly in many different ways by the military, many of which we don't know about yet. But in terms of surveillance, in terms of pattern recognition, in terms of picking targets, what's it really doing? Like, how much is it guiding things? How much human control is there still in the war that we're seeing? And also, information during wartime is largely comprised of propaganda on both sides. And, we're seeing even in peacetime, we're seeing huge infiltration of AI on many of the social media sites that we see. With AI, how do you trust what you see with your eyes? How do you trust a still capture, an image? How do you trust a video of, say, place being bombed? I mean, it could all be AI generated. In fact, over half of it is generated from AI on things like Facebook and other social media platforms. So this is becoming a huge issue and problem. And of course, the climate penalty of AI is extremely high with all of the different servers and electrical power and so on. The other thing is that there's always the issue with, war is right in your face. It's urgent, it's immediate, it's right there. It tends to dominate any other news cycles. climate change is longer time scales, something off in 10 years or 20 years often, but that's changing. Now we're seeing extreme weather events around the planet. The amplitudes of climate, people talk about a 1.5 or 2 degrees as being a big problem. The general public might say, well, it was -10 this morning and it was +15 this afternoon. That's a 25 degrees Celsius swing. How can I possibly worry about 1.5 or 2 degrees? So climate change is affecting so many things. Like, let's look at the anxiety and stress of people in society, not just from event, but we talk about higher greenhouse gas levels and climate. What are higher CO2 levels do to the human body? We evolved with CO2 levels between 2 and 300 parts per million. Now we're pushing over 400. So it acidifies our blood. It changes the chemistry of our blood. It increases amounts of bicarbonate in our blood to balance that pH in our blood. Calcium and phosphorus is taken from the bones. Bones are being embrittled in our human skeletons, and our blood chemistry is changing, and it increases our propensity to anxiety. So these are some new findings of what CO2 is actually doing. We didn't evolve ever in our human history with levels so high. So basically, we're being hit from external things, but also internal. Our body chemistry changing internally. The way we handle stress is changing. All of these things are not very helpful for dealing with today's issues.
Well, for those of you who thought that war and climate change wasn't bad enough, Paul has just begun to paint a picture, yet something that I'm sure we'll explore more in the coming weeks, and that is the impact of increased emissions and greenhouse gas concentrations of carbon dioxide and perhaps other greenhouse gases on our actual health and our ability to function in today's world. And with that additional sobering comment, let me turn it back to Peter.
Thanks. And thanks, Dan, for reminding us that we really do have to work hard to make our democracy work. And in my view, hope is actually courage. Hope is activity. Hope is being involved. And you're a great example of that. We need more people like that, obviously, because we do have a complacency in the face of climate change. And we've got more than a complacency in the face of war, because I believe for a long, long time, that our civilization, our society has a deep belief in war that we haven't had before, and other societies haven't had. That's not natural, as Harari says, but we have this insane belief in war. And as I said, I believe also that war making, we're over, I think Paul mentioned well over $2.4 trillion, That's evidence of the insanity of believing in war and allowing climate change and emissions to continue to increase. However, really, having said that, democracy and the nation state has never been very good for Mother Earth, never been very good for the environment. So we really do have a problem with the nation state-based form of democracy. The IPCC in 2018 said something that I thought was very wise and very important, and that was that in order to avoid back then 1.5 degrees C, which of course is long gone, we had to transform every level and sector of society. That was a very, very important, very wise statement by the International Governmental Panel for Climate Change. Finally, of course, I will completely agree and support Paul. Everything's getting worse, right? I mean, everything about climate is getting worse and worse, faster and faster. We know now, we've had absolute confirmation that climate change is accelerating. It's accelerating right up to the present, right? And so my final comment will be, we have this terrible back off from climate change, not only the public, but also governments. It's not just the United States. And of course, the Republican Trump fossil fuel administration is very much a part of this, but it's not just in the US, because he is forcing other nation states to back off from their regulations, including the EU, for heaven's sake, on emissions and climate change. The motivation, I believe, is that we all have to be as scared as hell about what's going on. I believe that's the motivation.
But Peter, could I just respond briefly to your point that it is a fundamental problem that we have organized the world as a community of nation states? And, I think that's an important point. And extending that a little bit, then that goes to the sources of international law, which, after all, is formulated by the practices of nation states, the treaties and other agreements that they enter into. But I just want to remind us all that it was just 81 years ago in San Francisco, June of 1945, at the end of World War II, where 50 of those nation states, led by the United States and Britain and others, gathered to formulate and institute the United Nations Charter in order to, as it says, end the scourge of war for future generations. Well, an important point made in the Charter, which then has been agreed to by 193 nations as a whole to date, almost all nations on earth, is that peace and security guaranteed by international law, or at least enforced through international law, are necessary ingredients to secure the level of cooperation between nations and among nations needed to solve, as it says, quote, international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian or scientific character. And that's exactly what we have here with respect to the climate crisis. So while it may be inadequate, domestic law, international law, the United Nations Charter, the UNFCCC Treaty, these are the tools that we have at our disposal. And while they may be inadequate, we need to gather together with all of our talent and commitment and drive to ensure that they are not wiped off the books and from the planet, because I think it is in the enforcement of these agreements, these norms, these requirements that we will be able to pursue a better world long term.
Well, thanks, Dan. That's very eloquent, and we can only hope that your plea, and it's based not just on something you thought of this morning when you got up, but your decades of working with countries all over the world with treaties. So you come to us with an incredible amount of perspective. We will do all we can here to try to get the word out that it is only by going back to a rule of law, internationally and nationally, that these problems ultimately can be solved. And I personally think that's entirely possible. It doesn't look like it right now, but with a change in administration, with a revulsion, like in the United States, the support for this war at the beginning was pretty much the lowest in modern history. Typically, a president gets 60, 70, 80% when he announces going to war. This was closer to 40% or so to begin with, and I'm sure it hasn't increased. And so we can't take our gas off the pedal, excuse my oil metaphor there, as we move forward. So let me thank you again, Dan. Every time you've come, you've been eloquent, you've been on the money, and I certainly urge all of our viewers, particularly those in the United States, sign the petition, talk to your congresspeople, write to the White House. Don't allow decisions and actions like the one we're experiencing now to be made without the will of the people. It comes down to something as simple as that. Simple doesn't mean easy, but simple may mean that there's great clarity.
If there's anything I would add, I would just say that the world is very uncertain, obviously, for many different reasons. And we haven't really crossed major tipping points in the climate system. The climate system is quite capable of extremely abrupt changes, whether it be the ocean current shutting off, the jet streams completely rewiring. When those things happen, there's going to be even more stresses on society, leading to a higher propensity for war, and we haven't reached those. There are things that many of us have talked about: carbon removal from the atmosphere, cooling the planet to preserve stable society, things like that. And I think those are going to become more important as we move forward.
Thanks, Paul. Peter, any last thoughts?
Just a quick one. As I said, I was so happy that I came across Bucky Fuller again just yesterday in his 1969 book, in which he warned us, or almost prophetically, that if we don't work cooperatively together, and whether that's nation states or groups or the whole world. His assessment was that we faced oblivion because we haven't chosen utopia. So for many years, I've been trying to put climate change and the solution to climate change as societal choice between the best of all possible futures and the worst of all possible futures. So I do think we have to work towards, in our minds and hearts, towards the best of all possible futures.
Very well said, very eloquent, and it reminds me of my own excitement reading Bucky Fuller and lots of other people in the 60s, betraying my age, I guess. But there's so much I think that every generation can learn from so many of the speakers and writers in that era. So once again, let me thank Peter, let me thank Paul, and in particular, let me thank Dan. We wish you luck and support in your petition and all of your other legal and other efforts to basically bring back the rule of law, something none of us probably a few years ago would ever think we'd have to say to bring back the rule of law. But I think that's a fair thing to say, at least in the United States and unfortunately in many other countries as well. Well, after that remarkable conversation on some of the dimensions of war and what we're dealing with right now, let me turn to what we call the Climate Three. Three of the most important stories of the past week, 1 minute each. First, China has announced their new 5-year plan. And while they are talking about accelerating their progress on green energy in multiple dimensions, and because they are by far the world's largest emitter, that's critically important. There's also a downside to their 5-year plan. They're projecting that the capacity of the coal industry in China will increase up to almost 6 billion tons by 2030. In the last 5-year plan, it was 4.6 billion, and it's now 5.1 billion. So as much as many of us hope that China will lead the world, they're basically sort of doing two hands at one time. They're increasing renewables and they're also increasing fossil fuel use, unfortunately. That's our first climate story. The second is a really interesting, at least to me, and I think maybe to you, a study that took a look or takes a look at the impact of fires from 2001 through 2019. In other words, the first 20 years of this century, where the scientists compared the fires in Alaska to the fires next door in Canada. And what they found was that the fires in Canada actually had a net cooling impact in the area, whereas the fires in Alaska right next door had a net heating impact. And that had to do with whether the land was permafrost, the nature of the species, and so forth. And we only have a minute, so I'm not going to get into details, but it shows you, I think, the complexity of climate change, that fires in two separate areas next door to each other, Alaska and Western Canada, have had opposite impacts on whether the global temperature is cooling or heating. The third story has to do with a very interesting and somewhat controversial experiment that just occurred 50 miles off the coast of Massachusetts in the United States, where a group of researchers are trying to address the extraordinarily challenging problem of the fact that oceans are getting more acidic. And the idea is to see if we can enhance the alkalinity of oceans. It's called ocean alkalinity enhancement. They dumped tons of a substance that basically the goal is to move the pH to a more alkaline balance, which is healthier for the ocean. And what they found in their preliminary results is the pH went from just under 8 to 8.3, which is a dramatic increase in pH and exactly in the direction that they wanted to. And that portion of the ocean drew down 10 more tons of carbon. So it removed 10 tons of carbon from the atmosphere. So this is a very promising beginning. Now, obviously, to do that with the whole ocean, it would take more than a couple of ships. But this is something I think that we should all keep an eye out for, as we may have to do this kind of human intervention to bring our oceans back to health, which is a critical and necessary aspect for our health and the health of all life on Earth. So with that, I want to thank everybody for, I think, an important program today. And once more, let me remind you to like our channel, to subscribe, tell all your friends and neighbors about the program, leave us your comments and go to our website, climateemergencyforum.org, and we would really appreciate any donations you could give to keep these programs coming in the future. And with that, until next week, thanks as always. We'll see you then.